Okay, good evening everyone. Welcome to our new course, Great Debates in Jewish History. It's going to be a fascinating experience. I want to welcome everyone who's been here before and taken the JLI course before. Welcome back. Those who are here for the first time, welcome. Those who are here just for tonight and would like to sign up after tonight, please speak to Andrew on your way out. And if you do register for the full course, I will be able to have a book for you in time for next week. So when we speak about great debates in Jewish history, Jews are always fighting with each other. We're always debating. They say, 2 Jews, 3 opinions. Right?
No, we know that.
No? And it's nothing new. And there was one time a new rabbi comes to their shul, and it's his first Shavuot service that he's ever been in the shul. And he sees when everything is going fine until it comes time for the reading of the Ten Commandments. As soon as they start reading of the Ten Commandments, half of the congregation rises. The other half of the congregation starts screaming and say, "We don't rise in this shul when it comes to the Ten Commandments. We sit." And those that stood up say, "No, in this shul we stand. We don't sit. You don't know what you're talking about. We do stand." And it's terrible. It's a disaster. They're screaming at each other, and this young rabbi, Nebuch, he doesn't know what to do. He's new in town. So he decides after Yom Tov he's going to get down to the bottom of it. The last remaining member of the founding fathers of the shul is still alive, sitting somewhere in an old age home. He tracks him down and he goes to visit old Abe. He's sitting there, 99 years old in the old age home. And they come to him and they say, "Abe, maybe you remember what's the custom of the shul?" And he says, "Listen, I'm an old man. I really don't remember." So the rabbi is there with the whole delegation from the shul, and those that were standing up said, "What do you mean you don't remember? Of course the custom was that we would stand up." And he says, "Listen, I'm really sorry, but I really don't remember." And they say, "I'm telling you we stand up." And then the other group says, "No, we don't stand up. What are you talking about? Don't you remember we don't stand up?" And he tells them, "Listen, I really don't remember. I don't remember if we stand up or we don't stand up." And then, right there in the old age home, a ruckus breaks out. And they're screaming at each other, and they're fighting, and this one says we do stand up, and that one says we don't stand up. Then old Abe says, now I remember, that's the custom. So, great debates in Jewish history. We have many debates, and in this course we are going to discuss 6 pivotal debates that rocked the entire Jewish community. Before we begin, I would like to take this opportunity to thank Larry and Mandy for sponsoring this course.
Thank you.
And allowing us to offer it for the prices that we do. If anyone goes to myjli.com, you'll understand what I'm talking about. Everywhere else in the world, it's about double the price or more for this course. So thank you very much. It's really appreciated. We are going to go through 6 debates over the next 6 weeks. And before we start, I'm going to run through them very briefly, like that we know what we're getting into, for those that haven't seen the brochure yet. We are going to be discussing the background, the motives, the reasons why these happened, when they happened, the 2 sides, and more importantly, the lessons that we can learn from them today. How these debates influence Judaism and Jewish history for all of the time following that, and what influence that has on us today. So the first one, which is going to be tonight, is going to be about the Dead Sea Scrolls. We'll get to soon. Next week, we're going to be discussing Masada versus Yavne, the group that took their lives, whether it was a good idea for the revolt against Rome or not. That's going to be next week. The third week is going to be the controversy surrounding Maimonides. For those that don't know, Maimonides is one of the greatest Jewish thinkers and philosophers that we have in Judaism, and believe it or not, his books were burned publicly. Now, that's crazy. I study Maimonides every single day, and it's outstanding. It's crazy to think that this individual, who is so respected and so big in Jewish thought, his books should have been publicly burned. But there was a big debate about that, and we will get to that. The fourth week is going to be about the renewal of the Sanhedrin. The 16th century, there was a big debate about that. Should we renew the Sanhedrin? Shouldn't we renew the Sanhedrin? The Sanhedrin is a Jewish high court, and that also split the entire community. Then in the 5th week, we are going to be talking about these Hasidic Jews. What's wrong with them? All those people that look like me. And the whole Hasidic Renaissance. What's this business? And there was a big fight about that as well, and it split the entire Jewish community. So we are going to be discussing that. And finally, something more recent, the final week we're going to be talking about religion in public. And if it's a good idea for us to practice our religion in public. In America, this is known as the separation of church and state, but it's about religious freedom and practicing religion in public. But we are going to begin tonight. That's just a rundown of all the 6. We're going to begin tonight, as you all know, about the Dead Sea Scrolls and the great debate that we're able to see through a close reading of some of these scrolls. We're going to begin with a short video that gives us just the background of the find of when these scrolls were discovered and some general information about them, and then we're going to be able to get right into it.
November 25th, 1947.
The United States.
4 days before the UN would vote for the partition plan to grant Israel its statehood. Israeli-Arab tensions are spiraling madly, hurling the region to the brink of war. But in the old city of Jerusalem, 2 men stand beside the Jaffa Gate, separated by a barbed wire security fence, with something far more benign on their minds. Elazar Sukenik, a Jewish professor of archaeology at the Hebrew University, faces an Armenian antiquities dealer. Through the barrier's crevices, the dealer displays an ancient-looking fragment with Hebrew script. Sukenik is curious and excited. In his diary entry for that date, Sukenik records, "A Hebrew book has been discovered in a jar. He showed me a fragment written on parchment. Geniza?" Sukenik was the first Jew since ancient times to behold a fragment from a vast collection that had just begun to be unearthed in the Dead Sea region.
He actually was the first one to recognize the antiquity of the scrolls, and he knew the date the minute he looked at the script. He recognized it from some of the monuments around Jerusalem that had similar type of script. Now, he had no idea really that was going to open up a whole world to us in terms of not just the Dead Sea community, but a lot of things about Judaism in the period. I think it's fair to say that the Dead Sea Scrolls are the most important archaeological discovery of the 20th century.
About a year earlier, 3 Bedouin shepherds were tending their sheep and goats on the northwestern side of the Dead Sea. These shepherds would habitually explore desert caves. One of them flung a rock into a cave that was situated above the plateau where his animals were grazing. He heard the sound of something shattering within the cave.
We now know that this particular Bedouin family was specializing in hunting for antiquities. So these kids threw a stone into a cave. They heard something. They went in, and before they knew it, they had discovered the first 7 Dead Sea Scrolls.
The shepherds failed to comprehend the meaning or value of what they had found, but they removed the scrolls, which were then passed through several hands over the course of a year, until a scroll fragment was displayed to Sukenik by the Jaffa Gate. During the following decade, thousands of fragments believed to be from approximately 900 different scrolls came to light.
Now, these scrolls were mostly written in Hebrew. We generally say that about 80% were in Hebrew, about 20% were in Aramaic, and there are some very small fragments written in Greek. There's a date of composition, and of course that goes way, way back because the earliest scrolls are the Torah. But the sectarian documents were primarily written in the 2nd and 1st centuries before the Common Era. Now, if we talk about the date of copying, therefore, again, 2nd, 1st centuries, and a few in the 1st century CE.
The ancient parchments were discovered in 11 distinct caves in the vicinity of the ruins of an ancient settlement that locals refer to as Qumran. There is ample evidence to link the scrolls with the ancient settlement.
They, first of all, fit the same chronology in terms of what we know from archaeology and from the study of the scripts and carbon-14 dating. But then, as important, or maybe even more, we have what we call the pottery assemblages. Now, what's unique in these pottery assemblages is these big jars, which are really food storage jars, in which they put scrolls. These are found almost nowhere else but they're found in large numbers in these caves and in these buildings.
In addition to the overwhelming use of Hebrew or Aramaic, many of the parchments are copies of sections of the Bible, the oldest copies known to be in existence. Clearly, they are Jewish scrolls, written and copied by Jews for Jews. But which ancient Jews authored or commissioned these scrolls? What were their beliefs and practices? And what was their relationship with the rest of the Jewish community of the ancient homeland? As we discover more about these fascinating artifacts of ancient Israel, we will find ourselves confronted by an intriguing and great debate among Jewry of antiquity. A debate that lay undisturbed for millennia among the arid rocks bordering the Dead Sea.
Okay, so what was in these scrolls? A few questions. What was in these scrolls? Who wrote these scrolls? And how are they found? We're going to go through tonight, if we can divide this class into a few sections, just that we know where we're going. We're first going to discuss very briefly some of the facts of what the scrolls are, where they were found, in what condition they were found, and so on. Then we're going to get to the actual great debate that emerges from a reading of the actual scrolls. And finally, we're going to try and understand the theology behind that and the real difference in the core of the issue, the crux of the debate itself. What was at stake and what was being argued about. Now, when it comes to the Dead Sea Scrolls, this is a huge topic. Dozens of books have been written about it, and therefore we just have to stay focused on the specific issues that we're trying to deal with tonight. There could be many, many things that could be discussed about so many different issues surrounding the scrolls. We are primarily going to be dealing with a great debate that emerges from a reading of the text. And like you saw before, a debate between what we're going to call the Dead Sea Sect, which is the authors of these scrolls, which is a discussion in itself who this sect was, and we're going to get to that. And that was them against the mainstream, which was the sages, also known as the Pharisees, but the leaders of the mainstream Jewish community in Jerusalem. So let's just start with a few of the basic fun facts. This cave that you see on the screen, this is known as cave number 4. They found the scrolls in a total of 11 caves over a period of many years. It wasn't all at once. The reason why I brought a picture of this cave is because most of the scrolls that we're going to be reading tonight, I should say most of the fragments of scrolls that we're going to be reading tonight were found in this cave. They were found in a terrible condition. Most of them were not full scrolls. There are very few of them that were found full. Most of them were found in pieces because, as you can see, in this cave, what they think it was like a library of this set. And you see all these holes in the wall? They believe that these were shelves that housed all of these scrolls. Because when they found them, they were all on the floor, and there was piles and piles, deep piles of all of these broken pieces of scrolls. That's the way they were found. And that's why you're going to see how broken up they are, and that's why it took years and years for scholars to try to piece together these different pieces to try and figure out what's going on. Only very few of them were complete. Now, what's about the content of these scrolls? What does it actually say in them? So we can divide all of the scrolls that were found in this site into 3 general categories. Number 1, biblical scrolls. Scrolls that we have today in the Bible. For example, this is one of the only complete scrolls that was found as the scroll of Isaiah, and it's almost identical to the Sefer Yeshaya, the Isaiah that we have today, from 2,300 years ago. It's one of the only ones that was found complete. But besides and they found fragments from every single book of the Bible, besides the book of Esther. Okay, so every book besides the book of Esther, they found some of them only tiny fragments, but they have found pieces of every single book of the Bible besides Esther. So that's the first category of scrolls that were found. The second category is what's called Apocrypha, and it's other similar to Bible-style books. Other books written in the same style as the Bible, but were not canonized and are not considered part of the Bible itself. Okay? And then finally, the third category, which is most interesting for us, because this is what's going to reveal about the people living there, is all sorts of works that were written by those living there about their own life and about their ways, about their breakaway from the main community. They found there like kind of a manifesto of the rules of their community. And those are the interesting ones because those are the scrolls that can actually tell us a bit about these people and about their relationship to the mainstream and just about Jewish history at the time. So those are the most informative, and that's what we are going to be focusing on tonight. So this is a fragment of one of the scrolls that we're going to be reading tonight. This is known as the Damascus Scroll. It's called the Damascus Scroll because from all of the scrolls, it's the only one that was actually known about before they were found at the Dead Sea, because a copy of it was found in the Cairo Geniza and was published in 1911 already. It's the only one like that. And then we're going to be looking at a piece from these fragments as well. And this, when you just look at them in full, you can see why it was so difficult to figure out what's going on, because there's so much missing. And it's also important to realize why there are so many different people that have written about it, and there's so many things that you can read there. You know, when you have a scroll like this that's missing half of the words, anyone can say anything, can say, well, it may have said it there. So we're only going to be relying on those that are either probable or at least possible to have been said in those words, which are in those scrolls, which are very fragmented. So let's begin. If you open up your books on text 1a, which is on page 2, in order for us to get to the bottom of this, to figure out who these people are, who are they writing about, why did they break away, what was the story, we are going to look in the scrolls themselves and see what this was all about. Okay? The first scroll that we're going to read from in text 1a on page 2, like I said, it's from this third category of scrolls which they wrote just about, about themselves and about their ways. And this type of scroll has a name by the scholars that deal with the Dead Sea Scrolls, and it's called Pesher. Pesher means that these people had a certain way of writing in which they would take verses of the Bible and they would interpret them as if it's talking about their current day. So they would quote any given verse from one of the prophets, one of the writings, and they would say, Upsharo, and its interpretation is such and such, referring to something happening right then and there. Okay, so they're quoting verses from previous biblical books, and they're interpreting it about their day. And therefore these works are known as Pesher. Let's see what they write in the first one, text 1a. We're going to go around the room and read. If you don't want to read, just pass on to the next person. Let's start from Jeffrey. Text 1a, page 2.
Woe to the city of blood. It is all lies and full of robbery. Nahum 3:1. Its interpretation concerns the city of Ephraim, the seekers of falsehood at the end of days, who go by the falsehoods and lies.
Okay, so we're going to quickly read through some of these texts. At first they'll be quite unintelligible, but as we go on, you're going to see how all of this makes sense. So far we know that these people are writing about someone or some group of people, that they are false seekers of falsehood. They're referring to them as Ephraim. They go by falsehoods and lies. The second sampling comes from the very same scroll. Let's read 1b.
Its interpretation concerns those who lead Ephraim astray, in whose teaching is their falsehood, and whose lying tongue and dishonest lips lead many astray. Their kings, officers, priests, people, and the proselyte who converts.
Okay, so if I ask you already over here, what's the emotional temperature of these texts? High or low? High. Angry or happy? Angry, right? They're angry at someone. It's intense. There's people, they're liars, and they're leading people astray, and there's falsehoods, and they're calling these people Ephraim. So we already sense that there's a lot of friction over here from between the words. We don't know yet who they're talking about. We're going to find out soon. Let's see another selection from a different scroll in text 2. Over here again they're talking about a certain group in this way. Text 2.
All these things, the builders of the wall and those who daub it with plaster have not understood. The one who takes wind and preaches falsehoods preached to them, for which reason God became angry with his entire congregation. He hated the builders of the wall. He became angry with them and with all who followed him.
Okay, and finally, one more selection from a scroll that deals with their own way, their own laws that they had for themselves and their group, and that's text 3.
You know that we have separated from the mainstream of the people and from all their impurity, and from being involved in these things and from participating with them regarding these matters.
So what do we learn from these fragments just here right now? What can we already know? A few things. Number one, that we're talking about a sect, a group of people who by their own admission, have separated from the mainstream. Number two, we know that their opponents, they're calling them Ephraim, and they're calling them the builders of the wall. Now, we know that their opponents, we're going to discover their opponents are the sages, the Pharisees, the mainstream leadership of the Jewish community. Why are they calling their opponents the builders of the wall? We're going to return to that a bit later. Why are they calling them Ephraim? Why would a group call their opponents Ephraim? So most of the scholars that deal with these texts believe that the reason is because back in the days of King Shlomo, of Solomon, when there was the first breakaway from the Davidic dynasty, the breakaway was led by the tribe of Ephraim. And therefore, these people, by calling their opponents Ephraim, they're trying to say, you're like the bad guys. You're not the true Jewish community. The true Jewish community is like the house of David, which is us. You are Ephraim. You're like this breakaway. That's why they're calling them... The breakaway is calling the mainstream the breakaway, basically. They're calling them Ephraim. They're saying, you're the bad guys. You're not the real thing. We are the real Jewish people. That's why they call them Ephraim. That's what it's believed why they call them Ephraim. What else do we know? We know that where they lived, here, that's this place called Qumran. It's by the northwest side of the Dead Sea. And that is where the scrolls were found, in those caves. And there's an old settlement that they excavated over there, which, as we saw in the video, matched the scrolls that were found there. Some were also found in Qumran as well. So this is where these people were living. So it's clear, just from this itself, that there's a great debate going on. It's clear that there's something serious going on. The tone, the emotional level of these texts is very, very high. Someone is angry at someone, or a group of people is angry at a group of people, and we want to figure out why. What were they angry about? What was going on? What were they debating? What were they arguing about? So in order for us to understand this, we are going to read a text from the Mishnah. Now, just an introduction about the Mishnah. The Mishnah is the first compilation of Jewish law. It was compiled in the 2nd century of the Common Era by Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi. So this is important to remember for later, that the date of compilation of the Mishnah is the 2nd century of the Common Era, and this is the very first work that we have documenting Jewish law, other than the Torah itself, other than the Bible itself, but all of the laws and the details are first documented in the Mishnah. Now, we are going to study a text that is on the topic of ritual purity. So just a few words of introduction before we study this actual Mishnah, so we understand what we're talking about. For the most part, the laws of ritual purity are not observed today. That is because we don't have the temple standing in Yerushalayim. In the times of the temple, if you wanted to enter the temple, you had to be considered ritually pure, and therefore, today if you go to Yerushalayim, you'll find hundreds of mikvaot that they excavated, where people would go to mikvah before going onto the Temple Mount, before going into the temple. But today, for the most part, most of these laws are not applicable. But if you were a Jew that lived in temple times, you would be very, very concerned and very worried about the laws of ritual purity and impurity. Almost like today, for example, someone who observes the laws of kosher, just like those laws kind of govern their whole life, what they eat and when they eat, and what foods they eat and where. The same thing is, the laws of ritual purity and impurity was exactly the same thing. It would basically govern your life, because you are only allowed to be in certain places at certain times, and you can catch this ritual purity and impurity is contagious, and you can catch it if you're in the wrong place. A typical example is if you come in touch with a corpse, then you would be ritually impure, and you'd have to go to mikveh before you would go to the Temple Mount. So this stuff spreads. It's not just for people. It's for clothes, it's for food, it's for vessels. So it's a bad thing if you're not aware of these laws. A huge percentage of the Mishnah, actually about 20% of all 60 tractates of the Mishnah, 12 of them deal with these laws. So you can understand how central this topic is. Okay? So, what do we have? It's significant in temple times. You get rid of it through mikveh immersion. And one last thing is that in order for this impurity to catch and to go from one object to another, there has to be a sufficient link between one object and another in order for there to be a transfer. Now, these laws, when it comes to purity and impurity and mikveh and cleansing yourself from this ritual impurity, although it doesn't apply today for the most part, it's important to quote the words of Maimonides on this, who explains that there's a big misconception when it comes to the laws of mikvah. People think it has to do with, cleansing yourself from dirt, if you're dirty, you clean yourself. And I think it's important that we read the words of Maimonides, where he writes, in the laws of mikvah, it is clear and apparent matter that the concepts of purity and impurity are scriptural decrees, and they are not matters determined by a person's understanding. Similarly, immersion in a mikvah to ascend from impurity is included in the category of mitzvot, whose rationale exceeds human understanding, because impurity is not mud or filth that can be washed away with water. You can take a shower for an hour and a half and it won't help you. And you can go into a filthy mikvah and you'll be pure. So these are things that are God's decrees, and that's just the way they are. Now, one last introduction before we read the Mishnah is that in the time of the Mishnah, in the time of the temple, we know that there were different groups amongst the Jews. There were what's known as the Sadducees, and we're going to get to know this name, the Baitusim. In English, some people call it the Bethusians, but it's not so well known, so we just use the original word, the Baitusim. And these are different sectarian groups that did not accept many of the laws of the sages. They did not accept many of the laws of the Mishnah. And then you had the sages, who are known as the Pharisees. Okay, just by raise of hand, who's familiar with these terms from before? Because it's going to be important. If you're not familiar, you may want to just write them down so you know who's who. We're going to be using these names very often tonight. On the one side, there's the Sadducees, and we call them the spiritual cousins of the Baitusim, because these are two different groups who are very much related. They both don't accept many of the laws of the sages, and then the sages are known as the Pharisees. So it's Pharisees versus Sadducees / Baitusim. Okay, keep that in mind. The Mishnah is going to tell us about a law of ritual impurity, that there was an argument between the Sadducees and the Pharisees and the sages. And the Mishnah reports on this argument. And that's what we're going to read about in text 4. Let's go, page 5.
The Sadducees say, "We complain to you, Pharisees, for you regard an uninterrupted flow of liquid as pure."
Okay, everyone look at me. I'm going to demonstrate what this is all about. This is not a magic trick. You wouldn't believe this is what the whole argument is about. Look very carefully. Saw that? That's what the argument is about. Now, what do I mean? Like I said, there has to be a sufficient link between something which is pure and impure for this ritual impurity to spread. Here the question is, the Mishnah reports that according to the sages, what happens if this cup is impure? Okay? Let's say it was in touch with something that was impure. This water is pure. What happens when I pour the water into the cup? Everyone agrees that the water now becomes impure. No question about that. But remember we said that if there's a sufficient link between something that's impure and pure, it can carry the impurity over. So here's the thing. Well, if I do that again, it'll overflow. When the water is pouring, you can look at the screen, when the water is pouring, is that considered a sufficient link to transfer the impure water from the cup and turn the water in the jug, and in turn the jug, to make that impure as well? And the sages ruled, no, that's not a sufficient link. In Hebrew it's called nitzuk, which means this flow, and it's not considered a link. And they report over here that the Sadducees complained to them. The Sadducees, they were even more religious, these guys. They said, "Oh, what do you mean? Of course it's impure. It's a link." And the Pharisees said that what's in the cup is impure because of the cup, and what's in the jug remains pure. It's not considered a sufficient link. That's the Pharisees, the sages of the Mishnah. The Sadducees argued with that, and they said, no, the whole thing gets impure. So this is what the Mishnah is reporting on about. Now, let us now return. So we know about this. This was a debate that was going on between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Now let's return to the Dead Sea Scrolls. And we're going to quote from another scroll that we just quoted from earlier. The scroll that we quoted from earlier that said, "And we've separated from you." If you remember, we said in text 3, "You know that we have separated from the mainstream of the people and from all the impurity." Right? Text 3. Now, in that very same scroll, the Dead Sea sect, look what they write. They themselves write that this is a whole scroll of them complaining to the sages, they're complaining to the Pharisees, they're explaining why they've broken away from them. And the whole style is, you say this, but we say this. You say that, and we say that. You say that, and we say that. Look what they're going to say. They're going to confirm now that they're actually following that law, which the Mishnah told us about this argument. Let's see, in text 5. from that same scroll that we read before.
Also concerning unstructured flows of liquid, we say that they are not pure, and that these flows are not separate between the impure and pure. The liquid of an interrupted flow and the liquid in the vessel are like a single liquid.
Okay, so in their view, the impure bucket below makes the bottle impure because the impurity travels upwards and it ruins everything. So what do we know so far? Accordingly, we can say that at least in this case, if we want to say something about this Dead Sea sect, who were they? All we could say so far is that at least in this example, they followed Sadducee law, not the mainstream law of the Pharisees. They say that clearly themselves. We see it in the Mishnah, we see the Mishnah reported about it, and now we find the exact same case in the scrolls of them saying, we argue with this, and that basically tells us that they follow Sadducee law. Let's take another example where we see again that this group follows Sadducee law. And this is a much more known law. This is something that we all know about. It has to do with the calendar, and it has to do with Pesach and Shavuos, and most people are actually familiar with this because it continues till this very day. And that is that the Torah tells us that on the 15th day of the month of Nisan is Pesach. The Torah also tells us that then we have to start counting the Omer, and 49 days after the Omer, we have Shavuos. The only trouble is that there is one phrase that's a bit ambiguous, and that is, when do we start counting? When do we begin to count? So, the Torah tells us like this: the 15th day of the month is Nisan, is Pesach. That's clear. No one argues about that. Then the Torah says like this: on the morrow of Shabbat, Mimacharat HaShabbat, on the morrow of Shabbat, then you should begin counting. Now here comes all the trouble. What does the morrow of Shabbat mean? We're talking about Pesach. The morrow of Shabbat. And 49 days later, it says, is going to be the holiday of Shavuot. So we really need to figure out when the morrow of Shabbat is, otherwise we don't know when to eat cheesecake. It's going to be a big deal. Yeah, and you'll see it was a big deal, because there was an argument about this between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. The Pharisees said, the morrow of Shabbat over here, Shabbat in this context means Pesach. Because the Torah many times, many of the festivals are also called Shabbat. Because after all, what does Shabbat mean? Shabbat means rest. Just like Yom Kippur is called Shabbat Shabbaton, and Yom Kippur isn't always on Shabbat. The same thing is, many of the festivals are called in Scripture all over the place as Shabbat, because it literally just means to rest. And just like on a Shabbos we rest, on a Yom Tov we rest as well. So the Pharisees had a tradition going back all the way to Moses, and they also proved it with proofs that, if you want to read afterwards in the appendix, you have 2 pages of the Talmud proving that in this situation, in this case, the word Shabbat actually refers to Pesach, telling us that on the day after the 15th of Nisan, so the morrow of the 15th of Nisan, we start counting the Omer. That's exactly what we do till today. On the second night of Pesach, which is morrow of the first day, we begin counting. And 49 days later, we have Shavuot, and everything is wonderful. Now, in the times of the temple, before counting the Omer, what does Omer actually mean? Omer is a sacrifice that was brought in the temple. It was a portion of barley that had to be harvested that night. So the Torah says, on that night you should harvest the barley, and the next day you begin counting. So which means that at the conclusion of the day of Yom Tov, they would go and harvest barley, bring it as an offering, and then the count would begin. Now, what happens if Pesach falls on Friday? So when does this harvest have to take place? Friday night. And that's no problem with that at all, because in the temple, all the laws of Shabbat were never said with regard to the service in the temple. And all of the service in the temple would technically look like a desecration of Shabbat. Everything was done there as regular. So if the time to harvest the barley is Friday night for the offering, Friday night you go out and harvest the barley. This is the way the Pharisees taught, and this is the way it was practiced. But here comes the problem. The Sadducees, they said, no. The morrow of Shabbat, it doesn't mean Pesach. It means Shabbat. Which means that whenever day Pesach is, we wait till the following Sunday to start, the morrow of Shabbat. So let's say, if Pesach falls on Tuesday, we don't start Tuesday night, cut, and then start counting. We wait till the next Sunday, because they said, no, it says Shabbat, and it means Shabbat, and it means what it says, and that's all. This was a big argument.
So that means Shavuot to them
was later.
It would be on a different day.
Exactly. That's why we don't do it like them, because they had to wait for their cheesecake another week sometimes. But that's exactly what happened. Yeah, it would have an effect on when Shavuot would be. So this, you can understand why this was this has ramifications. It's not just some theoretical debate. So here the Mishnah tells us in text 6, we're going to read an account of the Mishnah. That the Mishnah describes to us the event that was done with big fanfare and a big tumult was made on when they would actually go ahead and cut this harvest for the barley offering the next day. And there's an amazing description in the Mishnah, and we're going to see how it's connected to this debate. Let's see text 6.
Residents from all cities that were near the location of the reaping would gather there so that the reaping would be carried out with great fanfare. Once night fell, the reaper would say to those gathered, "Has the sun set?" And they would answer affirmatively. He would ask again, "Has the sun set?" And they would answer affirmatively. "With this sickle?" And they would answer affirmatively. "With this sickle?" And they would answer affirmatively. "This basket?" And they would answer affirmatively. "This basket?" And they would answer affirmatively. If it were Friday night, he would say to them, "Is it Shabbat?" And they would answer affirmatively. "Is it Shabbat?" And they would answer affirmatively.
This is a reaper with the stutter.
Yeah.
Shall I reap? And they would answer reap. "Shall I reap?" And they would answer reap. He would ask each question 3 times, and they would respond affirmatively 3 times. What was the purpose of this ritual? Because of the Beitzusim, who used to say that the Omer was not reaped at the close of the festival.
Right, remember Beitzusim is the same as Sadducees. So the sages instituted this long-winded ritual just in order to underscore that the halacha does not follow the Beitzusim, does not follow the Sadducees, and to say no, that the meaning of the verse of Shabbat over here means Pesach, and therefore if it falls on Friday night we're going to go to reap, because this is the day that it's supposed to be. And to underscore this, they did this whole ceremony, and they called everyone there, and everyone observed, just in order to prove the point that the true meaning of the halacha over here is that the morrow of Shabbat means the day after Pesach. This is exactly what they did. And obviously, as was mentioned, this would have an effect on when Shavuot would fall. Because according to the Pharisees, according to the sages, Shavuot would always fall 49 days after the second day of Pesach, as it does today. But according to the Sadducees, it could be any time. It could be within a 5-day gap, or 6-day gap, because you always have to wait till the next Sunday. And only the next Sunday, then you begin to count. Where did the Dead Sea sectarians fall in all this? Not so hard to guess. We're going to see soon from another scroll of the Dead Sea sect that they also observed. They write that Pesach is on a Tuesday. We begin counting the Omer on a Sunday, and Shavuot is a few weeks later on a Sunday. Who does that follow? Sadducees. If Pesach's on a Tuesday, according to the Pharisees, when do you start counting? Tuesday night, the next day. Yeah? But they waited until the following Sunday. Let's see how we read that in text 7. As you see, text 7 is very, very fragmented, to the extent they didn't even put the Hebrew over here. You only have the English. Let's read it.
On the 3rd day, in the week of the sons of Mount Seir, falls his Passover. On the 1st day in Judea falls the waving of the Omer. On the 5th day of Sion falls the second Passover. On the 1st day in Yeshua falls the festival of the weeks.
Okay, you may be wondering what all of those names are, of Sa'orim and Yediah and Yeshua, what's all of that about? That is just the way they referred to the weeks in those days. Just like today, it would be common in, let's say if I would be writing a letter today, in Hebrew I would write, today is Wednesday of the week of Chayei Sarah, because we read the Torah portion of Chayei Sarah. In the temple time, they would refer to weeks by the name of the family of Kohanim who served in the temple. Yeah. So let's say, we would say, this is Jeffrey Greenberg's week, because everyone knew that that's the week that the Greenberg family is serving. Or this is the Sperling week, because that's the day that this group of Kohanim is serving in the temple. Yeah? That's the way it worked. And everyone knew, that because all the Kohanim were divided into groups, and people would refer to weeks by the name of whichever family was serving there. And here you see from the calendar of the Dead Sea sect, that they say, on Tuesday of the week of, Mosiah, which is one of the families, is going to be Pesach. And when do we start counting? The following Sunday. Who does that align with? The Sadducees. So we see again a second example how the Dead Sea sect, at least when it came to halacha, when it came to the halachic rulings, they followed the Sadducees. Just if you look on the screen, we could just go over this in short so you see what the differences are. According to the Pharisees, the Omer is born on the second day of Passover. According to the Sadducees and the Baitusim, it's born on the next Sunday. Therefore, Shavuot, the Sadducees, it would be 49 days from whatever the Sunday was. Yes?
Can I just ask a quick question? With the Pharisees and Sadducees, what was the proportion of population at the time?
We're going to read about that soon. We have a text from Josephus, who's a famous Jewish historian, who writes that the majority of the people were the Pharisees. We're going to see his text about that soon. Yeah? Any other questions before we go on?
I wouldn't be preempting anything like by saying the main reason of the difference is because the Sadducees and the Baitusim do not follow the oral law.
Oh, very good. We're going to go there. You're on track. We're going to go there. Yeah? Yes?
Again, I hope I'm not jumping ahead. Where do the Essenes come in?
Very good question. I was waiting for someone to ask that. There's that. If you remind me, it's just going to go on a tangent if we do that now, but just in short, our question is that there is a group that we know about. Josephus writes about the Essenes, and there's a lot of discussion whether this group is the Essenes or not. For the purpose of this class, basically there's a debate about it amongst the scholars, and we can discuss that afterwards what the reasons are. For the purpose of this class, it doesn't actually make a difference whether they are or not. All we need to know is whose halacha they followed. So whether it was the Essenes or not the Essenes, we know that they followed Sadducee halacha. But remind me afterwards when we can speak about the Essenes and who they are. Okay.
What's the date that these were supposed to have been written?
These scrolls?
Yeah.
So according to the carbon dating, they were from between the second and first century before the Common Era, and some of them the first century of the Common Era.
So over 100 years.
Over 300 years. Okay. So we can already have some preliminary conclusions already now about what's going on over here. Number one, we have some quite a strong. This is just a slide that we did before. We don't need to do that. Okay. Some conclusions. Number one, that this Dead Sea sect followed Sadducee law. That's pretty clear. We're not saying that they are the Sadducees. If you know a bit about these groups, no one's saying that they are the Sadducees, because that also gets complicated because we know some differences between what we know about the Sadducees and this group. But we know that when it comes to specific issues, they follow Sadducee law. That's number one. Number two, we can now understand what this heavy tone against the Pharisees was. The primary cause of anger was with regard to issues of Jewish law. They were very upset about certain issues of Jewish law, and this is what they're screaming about. This is what they're clearly very upset about. But thirdly, and maybe more importantly, and perhaps one of the most important points of this whole lesson is right now. So if you weren't following, or if you're not going to be following afterwards, listen to this. And that is that what we've just read now from the Dead Sea Scrolls actually confirms to us something which has been questioned by many scholars, until today is questioned by many scholars. And that is, if you remember, I mentioned earlier that the Mishnah, which is what we believe is the authoritative text of Jewish law, was only written in the 2nd century of the Common Era. When are these scrolls written? We said in the 3rd, 2nd century before the Common Era. So we're going back about 400 years. Have you ever heard the term Rabbinic Judaism? What does the term Rabbinic Judaism say to you? I'll tell you what it says to me.
Is that Karaite?
No. It says Rabbinic. When people say, oh, that's just Rabbinic Judaism, they mean that's the stuff made up by the rabbis in the 2nd century. You know, it was after the revolt against Rome and the community was falling apart, and they needed to set up a system and create laws that people would follow. So the rabbis got together, very wise men, and they created what's known as Rabbinic Judaism. And there's many scholars today that want to say that as well. And that's what the whole Mishnah is. Comes to Dead Sea Scrolls, and we have now empirical evidence to tell us that actually the Mishnah is an authentic account of Judaism the way it was practiced 400 years earlier. And it's not as if it was just made up in the Mishnah, because what did we see over here? That what the Mishnah reports to us about these dialogue back and forth, the scrolls themselves, which are 400 years older, confirm that that is indeed the case. So without these people knowing it, even though they say they're the breakaway and we may not like them, but it so happens to be that their scrolls actually confirm our tradition and confirm that the mainstream, because they broke away from the mainstream, so the mainstream Jewish tradition was not invented in the 2nd century of the Common Era, but actually is the way Judaism was being practiced all the way back. That is a very important point that we can learn from this. Okay, so that's what the Mishnah is reporting earlier practiced Judaism as an authentic account of the way Judaism was practiced. Let's read from text 8. This comes from Professor Lawrence Schifferman, who's one of the leading scholars on the Dead Sea Scrolls, and he makes this point. Let's read that text 8. Page 9.
Before I read, can I
Yes.
just make a comment?
Yes.
My understanding of the Mishnah is that there does not seem to be any dispute, because all of the answers are affirmatively, which implies that everybody agreed.
The Mishnah is saying that they arranged this whole ceremony to go and cut the things. And we're talking about our own people over here. The Mishnah is saying that the temple would send out its representatives and its own people. And they would make a big show in front of everyone that came to watch. And it would be it was a show. It was made in advance. That it would tell the guy, ask, are you allowed to do it? And you should answer, you are allowed to do it. Ask, are you allowed to do it? And it's in order that the public should see that this is being done publicly. Right? And then the Mishnah says, why did we make this whole show? Why did the rabbis institute this whole show? In order that the bystanders should not think that the law is according to the Baitusim. And they should realize that this is actually the law, the way we're practicing it. In order that they shouldn't think that the law is like the Baitusim, that's why it's important to make this whole show and let everyone know we're doing it immediately following Pesach. Did I answer?
Yeah.
Okay, so let's see text 8.
The Qumran evidence reveals that, contrary to widespread scholarly opinion, Tannaitic literature preserves reliable information about the pre-70 CE Pharisees. These Pharisees, as they are illustrated by the Qumran material, are truly similar to what is described in the later rabbinic texts, especially as regards the specifics of their legal rulings. One thing is certain, the rabbinic system was not invented de novo after the destruction of the temple and the nation in the Great Revolt against Rome in 66-73 CE. It was a continuation, albeit with numerous changes and innovations, that based itself on the long tradition of Pharisaic Judaism, revealed more fully than ever before in the Dead Sea Scrolls.
That's a fascinating point that we learned from all of this. Now here comes the big question. Yeah? Before the big question, anyone has any little question? Yeah? No? Alright, we're doing well.
Do we know how long this group existed for?
Yes. We know that they started about when the scrolls, about 200 years before the Common Era, and there's no record of them from after the destruction. It seems like when the Romans took over the show, basically, that's the end of them. We're going to discuss some of that soon, why they didn't survive. Okay, here's the big question. Anyone that's familiar with Jewish learning, and that's been to a Gemara shir, even any shir, or even just seen two rabbis talking, or even went into yeshiva for a few minutes, will know that Jewish learning is all about debate. It's all about argument. You may have heard of the names Hillel and Shammai, who are forever arguing with each other. You may have heard the names Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Meir, who can never see eye to eye with each other when it comes to their positions on halacha. And nevertheless, there's never such this kind of tone of this kind of breaking away and making a new sect and name-calling and this high-level temperature attacks on the other position that you don't agree with. It's common in Jewish law that you have disagreements, and and afterwards we settle it, either by majority or however it's settled. But that's it. We argue, and then we go home and we're friends. And even says Hillel and Shammai, their children married each other. Even though you could look at them, you think these men must have been the biggest enemies. But no, they were study partners. They argued with each other all day, but they were friends. So what's going on over here? So they had some arguments when it came to Jewish law. They said you interpret it this way, we say you interpret it that way. They say the water is pure or not pure. This sounds exactly like the arguments in the Mishnah between all the sages. There must be something much more, much deeper over here that is causing all of this. And that is what we are going to see, that the truth is that this Dead Sea sect, they didn't just reject a few specific laws, but there was something much more fundamental and something much more central in Jewish law that they totally rejected. And that was the cause for this tone, and that was, of course, for the name calling and for the breakaway and for the reason why they said we cannot see eye to eye. It's like a different Judaism almost. What was it that was at the heart of this debate? What was it that they were really arguing about? So as Larry mentioned before, we have something called the Oral Torah. Now, what's the Oral Torah? Now I'll tell you something, we had a whole course about what the Oral Torah is, and we're not going to do that right now. So whoever was here when we did the course Judaism Decoded may be familiar with some of the things that we're going to be saying now. But it's always good to do a small recap, and however I can do it, I'll try to recap it for you very short. And that is, if one studies the Mishnah, one sees very clearly that the Mishnah, yes indeed, it's a compilation of all of the laws of the Torah, but there's much more in the Mishnah than what it says in the book. There's much more in the Mishnah than what it says in the written Torah. There's much more in the Mishnah, in the laws of the Mishnah, than what it says in the Torah scroll. Where did all of that come from? The answer is that we have something called the Oral Torah, or the oral tradition. And this oral tradition that came along together with the written Torah, this is what the Dead Sea sect and the Sadducees and the Baitis, and this is really what they didn't accept. This is what they didn't like, this is what they were against. What exactly, let's define, what exactly is this oral tradition? So if you see it on page 10, you have a learning exercise. I'm going to do it slightly differently to save the time, slightly differently than it says it. I'm going to tell you what to write, and then we're going to see how we find it in the text. So we're going to see that there's different categories within the Oral Torah. So we're going to discuss 3 general categories, okay? So on the first line you can write derived. Sorry, before the write received. Received Oral Torah. There's something called the received Oral Torah, or the received oral tradition. This is on page 10. You can take a pen right in front of you. Yeah, there's something called the received, and we're soon going to discuss exactly what that is. Then received Oral Torah. It was received. The next line you can write derived. There's something called the derived Oral Torah. These are all categories within the oral tradition that the Baitusim and Sadducees and Dead Sea sect rejected. Then the third line you can write legislated. Okay? And we are going to read now some texts from rabbinic and non-rabbinic sources that talk about these 3 categories and try to describe what they are. We're going to read the first 2 texts, and you're going to tell me, I'm going to ask if you can detect which one of these 3 categories of oral law, which I haven't really defined yet for you, which one of the 3 categories of law is being spoken about. So let's read the first text, text 9 from Josephus, who I'm sure you're all familiar with. He's the famous Jewish historian, Jewish Roman historian, who writes about this. And look what he says in text 9.
The Pharisees have passed on to the people a great many observances handed down by their fathers, which are not written down in the law of Moses.
And now let's read text 10.
Every mitzvah that God gave to Moses was given with its explanation. God would tell Moses the verse and then tell him its meaning, explanation, and all that was contained in the ingenious wording of the verse.
That's a quote from Maimonides. These 2 texts are both talking about which category of law? Received. Josephus says these are people that have received from their parents or have received from their parents. It's not stuff that says in the book, but they've just received it from their parents and grandparents. Maimonides qualifies and explains what this category is talking about. It says these received laws, where did they come from? They didn't come from nowhere. They received from their parents, yes, as Josephus says, but they go back. There's a starting point. What's a starting point? When God gave the Torah, He gave an explanation with it. He gave an oral tradition that goes with it, an interpretation of the Torah. That's category A. And that stuff was received. That's what we call the received oral Torah, that was handed down from generation to generation and goes back all the way to Moses. Now, why were we so sure about this concept? Why are we so sure that this is even true? Why are we even so sure that there is a received oral Torah? Who even said? So, like I said, for that you have the whole course. But just in a nutshell, two points. Number one, why am I so sure that this is true? Why am I so sure that there is an interpretation that comes to the Torah? You know why? Because that's what my father told me. When he taught me Torah, he taught me what it means. You know why he was so sure? That's what his father told him. You know why his father was so sure? That's what his father told him. And guess what? We have a chain going all the way back to the beginning. So, unless we have evidence to say someone is lying, why should I trust my father? He trusted his father, we trusted his father, and we have it going back all the way to the beginning. That's a simple reason why we know it's there. But there's, some people say, come on, already, come on. Maybe someone had a bad dream on the way and woke up on the wrong side of the bed and made stuff up. and you tell your kids anything and they believe you. So, But the truth is that there's much more to it. The received oral Torah is actually spoken about in the written Torah. The written Torah forces us, when we read the Bible, when we read the words of the written Torah, it forces us to conclude that there is a received oral tradition with it. Why? Because the written Torah says, keep all of the commandments. This is the difference between life and death. Follow the commandments and you'll live. Follow make sure to follow the commandments in all the details. You should follow them and then everything you'll get all the blessings. And it's commanding us that we should actually listen to what it says in it. So you're clearly telling a group of people that they should do what the book tells them to do. But here we have a problem. What does the book tell you to do? Nothing. If you read the Torah itself, you will know nothing. You won't know a single mitzvah what to do. So if the Torah is telling you, the Torah says follow everything it says there, and the Torah says it's not difficult to follow all of these laws, it's very simple, it's very easy. Really? Read a single verse and try and understand what it means. I'll give you one example. Put them on the doorposts of your house. Put what on the doorposts of your house? And the Torah says it's very easy to put them on the doorposts of your house. Do that. Do what? Obviously, Hashem explained Moses, Hashem explained Moshe Rabbeinu, what he means you should put on the door of your house. So this is the two, in very short, reasons why we say there is a received oral tradition. It's just basic. It must be that way. Yes? Yeah. About tefillin. Yeah, every single mitzvah of the Torah like that. You read the verse, you have no idea what it's talking about. You'll only know because you already know the tradition of what that verse means. Okay? Pick any example in the world that you want. And you really won't know. Okay. Now, here's the second. So this is what Josephus says that they received from their parents and their grandparents, and Maimonides qualifies this was gone, that Moses gave the interpretation. Now let's read text 11 and 12. Again, 11 from Josephus. Let's see. Page 12.
The Pharisees are those who are considered most skillfully in examination of their law and are the leading school.
Okay, and now let's see text 12, which explains this idea.
God gave to Moses, as part of the oral Torah, pathways of derivation hinted at in the Torah, so that sages of each generation can extract laws relevant for new developments. These pathways of derivation are the 13 hermeneutic rules that are mentioned in the beginning of Midrash, Torah Kohanim. By using one or more of these principles, one can learn how to act in cases not addressed explicitly by the Torah.
Okay, so here Josephus says that the Pharisees, they are the most skilled in being able to take the information of the Torah and deriving from it and seeing how it applies to new situations. And text 12 from Rabbi Yosef Albo, he explains what that means, that in the Torah itself, Hashem gave, together with the written Torah, gave rules of derivation, which means that if you follow these rules, you can come to conclusions. You can, like you say, 2 + 2 is 4. You can compare one thing to another thing and apply it to a new situation that does not say clearly in the Torah, was not said clearly by Moses, but he gave the rules. He gave the book, together with the rules of how it can be used in future times. And the sages in each generation have that authority and have that ability to study the Torah, apply those rules to the information in it, and through that derive new conclusions based on the pre-existing rules and the pre-existing text. That's the second thing which we're told about. And then, if you read text, why do we say, why must there be this category of law? It's simple. Because it's clear that not every single situation, the Torah cannot clearly write about every single situation that's going to happen. If the Torah would talk about electricity, no one would know what they're talking about then. But the Torah can give rules that if those rules are applied to electricity, we know how to go about that. And we know what the halachic take on electricity is. And the same thing with everything. There's rules of how to derive from one thing to another thing. And therefore, the Torah was also given together with the derived. And finally, the third thing, which let's read in text 13 from the Ethics of Our Fathers.
Moses received the Torah from Sinai and gave it over to Joshua. Joshua gave it over to the elders to the prophets, and the prophets gave it over to the men of the Great Assembly. The men of the Great Assembly will say these three things: be cautious in judgment, establish many pupils, and make a fence around the Torah.
Okay, let's focus on the last thing they said. Make a fence around the Torah. What's this fence around the Torah? This is what we call legislated. And that means that the Sanhedrin in each generation, the sages of each generation have the authority given by the Torah, in the written Torah, that when they see a certain situation, or for a certain reason, to legislate new law, they have the authority to do that. And that law is then considered binding Torah law. It doesn't say anywhere about, these are not laws that were given to Moses at Sinai, these are not laws that were derived using principles. These are when new situations came up and the sages felt that we must legislate new law. I mean, a good example for that is Hanukkah. The Torah doesn't talk about Hanukkah, and neither is it derived from any verse in the Torah that is Hanukkah, that we should light the menorah, because the story of Hanukkah happened about 1500 years after the Torah was given, but rather the rabbis at the time legislated a law that we should light the menorah every year on Hanukkah. Because when a new situation comes up, people won't recognize what to do. You won't be able to find, how to apply all things, and therefore you need to legislate. Yes, you had a question?
Yeah, is this what the Sadducees meant by the Pharisees building a wall?
Oh, yes, very good. You're jumping ahead, but yes, keep that in mind. Very good. Yeah? Okay. We're trying to put pieces of the puzzle together. Yeah? So the point is, when a new situation comes up, but they won't recognize what to do, and therefore you have to have someone to tell you what you're going to do. Say there was a North Korean immigrant that comes to England, and he goes into the supermarket, he goes into Asda, and he sees there's something called, he goes to the shelf, and he sees this potato powder. He says, "What's this?" And they say, "Well, put this with water and you have potatoes." He says, "Really? That's amazing. If you could take the potatoes," and he thought you're going to have potatoes. He said, "You take the powder, mix it with water, and you get potatoes." Fascinating. He moves to the next aisle, and he sees something called milk powder. He says, "What's this?" He says, "Well, you mix it with water and you get milk." He says, "Wow. Look what we have over here. It's good I managed to get out of that Meshuggah over there." Then he goes into the next aisle and he faints. They look at his hand, and you know what's in there? Baby powder. So the point is, new situations, you're not used to things that you have no idea how to relate to. How are you going to go about them? That's why we have to have the derived and the legislative that deal with these situations. And this is what we said is what the rabbis, what they call building a fence for the Torah. A typical example of building a fence for the Torah, which means securing, that the rabbis have the authority to secure that people should not transgress over the laws of the Torah. Okay? And therefore, they can hold people back from even coming closer to them. I should say another good example in this country at this time that maybe people can actually relate to. Everyone knows what's going on in Westminster these days. The scandal over there and wherever else. Well, guess what? This has nothing to do with Westminster. It has to do with human beings. People have been doing this since day one. Okay? And in the Jewish community as well. One of the legislated laws of the Sanhedrin was to help people avoid that kind of situation. Okay? It's called building a fence around the Torah. The Torah doesn't allow certain relationships to happen. That we all know. But how do you keep people away? Since those things do happen, and did happen. So, the sages said, we're going to build a wall around the corner. We're going to build a fence. You know what the fence is? You're never allowed to have two people themselves in the same room from the opposite gender. If they're locked in a room themselves. Well, we're not saying you can't do anything together. Forget that. That the Torah says. You're not allowed to be in the room together. Does it say that in the Torah? Is it derived? Is it received? No. It's legislated. The Sanhedrin have the authority to legislate to keep people away from transgressing over the Torah rule. And then that's considered Torah law as well. I mean, we all appreciate that if we're going down the road and we see a manhole, we see an electrical grid, we want to put a fence around it. We want people to stay away. We don't want people to get hurt. If we would be sensitive to the Torah laws as well, and we would realize the value of a mitzvah, and we would realize the detriment in not doing a mitzvah, we would also all appreciate those fences that the sages put around. It's there to protect us. It's there that we shouldn't come to violating a Torah law itself. That's what legislated is all about. Okay? Now, let's return...
Sorry, can I...
Yes.
So that is not rabbinic? Or what are you saying?
You can call it rabbinic, yeah. You call rabbinic legislated law, by their own admission. Yeah, legislated by the rabbis, absolutely. Yeah. But with the authority that the Torah gives them to do that. Now, the Sadducees, the Baitusim, the Dead Sea sect, they said, all of this, out the window. We don't believe in this whole framework. This is all the stuff that you made up. This never happened. We don't believe in any of this. This is what they rejected this whole framework outright. You know what they believed in? They said, just the written Torah, just the word of the written Torah, that's it. We don't believe in anything else. And all of this stuff out the window. No received, no derived, no legislated. And now you can understand why there was such fierce debate. You can understand what all of this heavy tone was. And why it's so different than Hillel and Shammai arguing. Because when Hillel and Shammai argue with each other, you know what they're arguing about? They both believe in this whole framework. And they're arguing with each other, is a specific derivation good or is it not good? Should we derive this way or should we derive that way? They're arguing about whether a specific legislation that was put forth will actually serve its purpose or not. Is it a good idea or is it a bad idea? But they all believed in they all believe in the actual framework. So that's why they could still be friends. But the Dead Sea sect and the Baitusim and the Sadducees, they said, goodbye, we don't believe in the whole thing, it's over. They rejected the whole thing categorically.
But how is it possible to practice Judaism?
Very good question. We're going to get to that in a moment. That is a very good question, because as we just said, it's impossible to understand anything without it. So how do we do it? Hold that question for a minute. Well, let's first just return to the text that we mentioned earlier, and we can do this all on the screen. If you remember in text 2 and text 3, when we quoted from the scrolls, we had all of these names, this name calling. We are going to see that in all that name calling, there's a lot of euphemism over there, and it's all referring to these ideas that we said here. Let's go back to that now. We do it on the screen. If you look in, it was in text 2, I think, they referred to text 1a, it was on page 2. They said that its interpretation concerns the city of Ephraim, seekers of falsehood at the end of days who go by falsehood and lies. The Hebrew term for seekers of falsehood, they're accusing the Pharisees for seeking falsehood. What did they use? They used the word dorshei hachalakot. Okay, which means seekers, dorshei is you seek, chalakot means a falsehood or a lie. Chalak is like when someone's chalak, you're smooth with them, you're lying. So they refer to the sages, they refer to the Pharisees as dorshei chalakot. But the scholars who study the Dead Sea Scrolls say this is a pun. Dorshei chalakot is actually a pun intended on the Pharisees who interpret the halachot. Because the word dorshei also means like medrash, interpretation. And what does the word chalakot sound like? Halacha. It's a play on the words. They're saying, you are dorshei halakot. You interpret false halachot. And they call it chalakot as a play on the words. Your halachot, they're halakot. It's not the real stuff. So that's why they're referring to them as dorshei halakot. And many times during the scrolls you see this term. These are the guys of the halakot. It's a play on words. They say, oh, these are the fake halachot. These are the Pharisees who are making up halachot. Because, what do we say? They reject the derived. They reject this whole business of deriving and interpreting laws. They also said, Talmud Shikram, which in text 1b, I think it was, they said that there's falsehood in their teachings. Yeah? They said there's falsehood in their teachings. But what does the word Talmud mean? Anyone's been to the Gemara? Talmud refers to the analytical style of learning. Comparing one thing to another thing, deriving. Again, by saying the Talmud Shikram, they're lying in their Talmud, it doesn't just mean they're lying with their teachings. They're trying to hint to their style of derivation. The Talmud Shikram, their analytical style, is false. Again, they're saying that they completely reject the derived oral Torah. And finally, Bonei Achetz, and Henry guessed it right, they called them the builders of the wall. They referred to these people, they're liars, seekers of falsehood, chalakot, and builders of the wall. A few times they call them the builders of the wall. What wall are we talking about? They're referring to the fence around the wall. The siyag laTorah, the fence around the wall that legislated. They're saying, we don't hold all this legislated stuff that you made to protect the Torah. We reject it categorically. And that is what they... so now we can actually close that circle and understand what the terms in those texts that we had in the beginning are actually referring to. But now comes the question that Keith asked. How did these guys live? They were practicing Jews. They were not just Orthodox. They were firmer than the sages. They said, we want to keep even more than you. Where did they get the conclusions from? They don't like the sages' framework, but what was their framework? You cannot just have the Torah itself. You must have some kind of system that goes with it. And this is where we are introduced to another thing that comes very often in the scroll, that these people refer to their leader by the name of Moreh Tzedek, which means they had this person they appointed. Moreh Tzedek means the teacher of righteousness. They had their leader who they looked at as like a prophet-like, divinely inspired individual who will teach them the laws. And that's it. We just rely on him. And they write about that. And in the next text that we have, in text 15, is actually a quote from this Moreh Tzedek himself, speaking about himself, and speaking about those people that reject him. And look how the way he refers, look at the wording, and you'll see how he refers. Again, he uses the term chalakot, referring to his opponents, and look how he refers to the truth about him. It's very telling. Text 15.
They are speakers of lies and seekers of falsehood. They planned evil against me to replace your Torah that you taught in my heart with falsehood to your people.
So the claim over here is that the sages are not accepting which Torah? The one that got placed in my heart. He placed it in my heart. No system of derivation of legislation or anything. He's like a prophet, who with divine inspiration has his way of interpreting it, and he's angry with all of the sages for arguing with the Torah which was placed in his heart. And this is how you have the Dead Sea sect against the rabbinic interpretation. Whereas the rabbis have this whole system of how law should be interpreted and legislated and how it was received and so on. These people, this sect, they believed in their Moreh Tzedek, the teacher of righteousness, who they looked at as like a prophet-like individual who was going to teach them the word of Hashem, just like Moses taught the word of Hashem. Now, what do we have to say about that? Yeah?
How can he teach something which is going to be some sort of oral teaching, isn't it?
So they believe that he's getting communication straight from Hashem. This is the thing. They say that, he's a prophet. He hears it straight from the source. So we don't need any of the other stuff. And he tells us exactly what we should do. You know what the trouble with this is? Yeah?
Well, this is a very similar situation to the Puritans. They had, in order to practice the religion the way they thought of it, which was back to the original text instead of what the church was teaching, they had to go off to America in order to be free of it. In the same way these Essenes or they had to go into the desert to go.
Right, that's exactly what they did, and they chose their. Yeah, it is. You can match many groups and many cult-like groups. The very similar thing. They have their one man that they appoint, and they say this is it, and he claims to have divine inspiration, and go argue with him. Either he does or he doesn't. But what do the sages say about that? Here's the problem: traditional Judaism rejects this categorically. You know why? Because even if there was someone that we would know was a prophet, and we have our own prophets, we have all books of prophets, a prophet doesn't have the authority to introduce a single mitzvah, or a single law, or a single new custom, anything. He doesn't have that authority. A prophet is about encouraging the people to follow the word of the Torah. The 613 mitzvahs of the Torah, you know where they're all said? In the 5 books of Moses. Not one in the prophets. All the books of the prophets. Not one of the 613 come from the prophets. Because a prophet isn't forbidden to introduce a new law. That's not the job of a prophet. And in the days of the Sanhedrin, if a prophet would try to do that, you know what happens to him? Capital punishment. That's considered a false prophet. So there's no such thing as a prophet coming and saying, I have the new word of Hashem. And an example that's given for this in text 16. Let's read that one in text 16, where we see how Jewish law categorically rejects this whole business of going to the prophet to hear the law and hear the word of Hashem when it comes to practicing the law.
3,000 laws were forgotten during the mourning period for Moses. The Jews asked Joshua, "Inquire of God." He responded, "It is not in heaven." They said to Samuel, "Inquire of God." He responded, "These are the commandments," meaning from here on, no prophet can introduce anything novel.
Okay? So what do we see from here? They forgot laws. And they wanted, in the times of Moses, what would they do? They would go to Moses and ask him to clarify, go have a word with God and find out what we should do. They thought they could do that in the time of Joshua as well. You know what he told them? Sorry, you know what you have to do now? You have to derive it. You have to figure it out, break your head, work with the information that you have, because the Torah itself tells us that this system of receiving the word straight from Hashem is over. It has an end date. The end date is with Moses. It was to Moses and to Moses only. No one else. And once Moses is gone, that kind of stuff is finished. Therefore, you forgot the laws. Either you won't remember them, or you'll have to figure them out. You'll have to derive them. You'll have to study. You'll have to try to figure them out. And that's the way it's going to work from now on. They tried that with Joshua. They tried it with Shmuel, with Samuel. they both told him the same answer, quoting different verses that basically forbid it and say there's no such thing. Either Torah lo b'shamayim, the Torah is not in heaven. It was given to us in order that we should work with it and that we should figure out on our own. So for the sages, to sum up, for the sages to rule a halacha based on divine inspiration is categorically rejected, even if there's someone who we actually believe is a prophet. Never mind if someone who's a so to speak prophet. But even if we would have a true prophet, you wouldn't be able to do anything like that. Which is why there was. Now we can understand what the two sides of this whole story is and what was going on over here. But now that we have this information, now that we understand where the Dead Sea sect would base their way of looking at the Torah, which is it all comes from God, it came from God in the beginning, and it continues to come from God, versus the sages who say, no, we, the people, have to strive to figure it out to know how to practice Judaism. Once we understand the debate like that, we can actually we have better words to frame what that core of the debate is. And that is as follows. The core of the debate is like this. That's not clear. The Dead Sea sect, they rely on prophecy for legal ruling. The Chazal, the sages, the Pharisees, they rely on human effort for legal ruling. Meaning it's a totally different frame, a totally different way of looking on what Torah is. Is it a top-down model where it all comes from Hashem and we are just robots, we're just passive listeners who have to just do as we're told? Or is it a bottom-up model where we have to strive and we have to work hard and we have to somehow connect and study and toil and figure out and derive the laws? That is what is it about. Is it just prophecy, which is word of Hashem, divine inspiration? Or is it given to the human being in order that he should work on it himself and reach those conclusions on his own? Now, here's the question. Who can offer what's the advantages and disadvantage of either of these systems? What would you say is the advantage and the disadvantage on a system of Torah that relies on prophecy? That we say all comes from heaven. What's an advantage of that system? Yeah, Louis.
When there are no prophets, where do they get the law?
Okay, that's one point. What about when there are prophets? That's a disadvantage. I'm saying, what's an advantage? What's an advantage of a system that relies on prophecy?
It's all settled because one person is telling you.
It's all settled because he's saying it's the word of Hashem and this is it. He has it from the original. Anything else? Another advantage? No, an advantage. What's an advantage?
Oh, sorry.
An advantage.
You can change.
Well, that could be an advantage.
Sorry?
You can change things according to current circumstances.
See, the prophet could change it if he hears from Hashem. Okay. What about a disadvantage? There's a major disadvantage on this kind of system. You know what it is?
You're dealing with a human being.
You don't think for yourself. Yeah.
Okay, number one, what Larry said, you don't think for yourself. The people are left out of it. They're almost like robots. They're not involved. They're not emotionally and intellectually involved in their Judaism because they're just listening. They're just doing as they're told. They're like robots. That's one disadvantage. But there's another major disadvantage on relying on prophecy for the whole thing. You know what it is? Confusion. Yes?
When the prophet dies, who do they ask?
Okay, or in other words, that's right, and I'm going to give some more words to that in a minute. Forget about who they ask, I'll tell you. What about while he's alive? You have one guy that says, I'm a prophet, I have the word of Hashem, and he says A, B, and C. Then comes the next guy and says, Hi, I'm also a prophet, I have the word of Hashem. What do we do now?
Too many cooks.
You know what? Exactly. There's nothing you can do. Who do you believe? Who are you supposed to believe? If we're relying on prophets to give the word of Hashem, anyone can say they're a prophet. And you either believe them or you don't believe them. So you're stuck. That's why we don't believe that a prophet can introduce a new mitzvah. A prophet is only there to encourage us to keep the word that was confirmed in front of the entire congregation that comes from Hashem. That is the difference. So that's a major disadvantage of going with the system of prophecy. What's a disadvantage of going with the Pharisee system? What's a disadvantage of going with the system of using human logic and human reasoning? What's a disadvantage of that?
Might not be able to get there.
Might not be able to get there, or anything else.
If I get a bit confused, so like as the language changes it. So
People can get confused.
yeah, and
Anything else? Mistakes! Human beings make mistakes. We claim to be having a divine Torah. And here we're saying that it's given over to the sages who are human beings, not prophets, to decide what's the... I mean, people make mistakes. Even the greatest rabbis make mistakes. So that's a major disadvantage of the Pharisees' their way of this bottom-up model. But nevertheless, there is a major, major advantage to that. And that is what we're going to explain now. And with that, we are going to really be able to get to the core and to the most essential point of what the argument between the Pharisees and the Sadducees is, whether we say it's a top-down approach or a bottoms-up approach. And that is that, according to the sages, according to the Pharisees, Torah is not just about a bunch of rules for us to follow. The purpose of Torah and the purpose of studying Torah was in order that the human being should take his human intellect and there should be a meeting of minds. He should use it in order to understand something divine. And through that connect, through that rise and reach a higher self and become something higher than he is on his own. And here's the balance. On the one hand, keeping that framework that was given straight from Hashem. So you have the framework that you can't leave that framework of the received, the derived, and legislated. But nevertheless, putting in your own strengths and your own talents to be able to derive and to be able to legislate and to be able to compare and to be able to study and figure out on your own what the Torah is. Through that, the human being is actually experiencing a transformation because he's becoming another person. Instead of just being human, he's using his intellect and he's connecting to something out of this world, which is Hashem's wisdom in the Torah. That is what the purpose is, and that is what the ultimate agenda of the sages was in their way of looking at the Torah. The Torah is about changing our life. The Torah is about changing the way we think. We should start thinking, we should start seeing the world through God's lenses. In the Sadducee model, what do you have? A bunch of robots who are just following the rules. They're not changing. Their perspective hasn't changed. They do not think in the way of the Torah. The sages wanted that the people should think in the way of the Torah. We should be able to come to I should be able to reach the Torah conclusions on my own, not to be told about them. And therefore, it's changing me. It's changing my outlook. It's changing the way I see the world. It's changing the way I see another person. That is what the ultimate is. It's about being able to make it your own and about being able to connect to it in a real way. That is the true ultimate goal of this. And now we get to the most fascinating part of it all. And this you need the wisdom of the Rebbe for. Where he basically says, and with this we're going to end, that remember we said earlier that one of the debates between the Pharisees and the Sadducees was about this business of Shavuos. When should you start counting the Omer? When do we begin to do this count? Do we begin on the day right after Yontif? Do we begin on the day right after Yontif? Do we wait till Sunday? Which is going to have an effect. When is going to be the holiday of Shavuos? Is it going to be on Sunday, according to the Sadducees, because it's always going to be 7 weeks after the Sunday? Or is it going to be 7 weeks after the day we start counting? Right? Remember we said we had that debate? That was one of the arguments. So the Pharisees say, you start counting the day after Yontif. The Sadducees say you have to wait till the following Shabbos. The Rebbe explains that this debate actually encapsulates and is reflective of the general core of the debate that we just explained before, about how we should view Judaism and how we should view Torah. It all reflects in that specific argument. So that argument isn't only a technical thing about when I should eat my cheesecake. Should it be on Sunday or should it be during the week? On which day Shavuot should fall on. But that argument is a reflection of two ways of thinking and two ways of understanding what Torah is all about. And here is the way it works. What's Shabbos? What kind of day is Shabbos? Shabbos is a top-down day. Who sanctified Shabbos? Hashem. Hashem sanctified it. It's not determined by human beings. Unlike holidays, the calendar was determined by the Beis Din in the time of the temple. Who decides what day is going to be the holidays? The Beis Din. But Shabbos, it's a week. Determined by God. That day is holy. That's it. Comes from the top and that's the way it is. We just observe it. We don't make it. And that's why work is forbidden on Shabbos. Human toil is forbidden. It's not about... We don't have a place in Shabbos. We're there to observe it. It's not about the human's a part that he plays. The Sadducees and the Baitusim and the Dead Sea sect, they said, you know what the best way to prepare for the giving of the Torah is that it should follow a day of Shabbat, which is a top-down approach. That is the way we look at the Torah. So the day that the giving of the Torah has to be, it always will have to be on a Sunday. We have to wait because it always has to follow Mimacharat HaShabbat. It has to come following a day that represents our whole outlook on what the Torah is all about, this top-down approach. And therefore they said, whatever day of the week Pesach is, you don't start that day, you wait till the next Shabbat and you start the day afterwards, which is going to end up making that Shavuot, which is the giving of the Torah, should follow a Shabbat. Because in their model, what was Torah, what was Judaism all about? Messages from Hashem, divine inspiration, coming straight from Him. It's nothing about us, we don't have a part in it. So the best way to prepare for that is Shabbat. According to the sages, according to the Pharisees, what's the whole point of the whole Torah? Just that we should be passive observers in it? Or we should actually have human effort and we should play part. We should be a part of God's story. Therefore they said the best way to prepare for the giving of the Torah is through counting. That's why we count the Omer. What's counting? I count and I have to go on my own journey. And when do I start counting from? The day after Yontif, which is determined by the human court, not determined by Hashem. Because that represents that the Pharisees said the best way to come to the Torah, the best way to prepare for the giving of the Torah is through changing myself. Is through me elevating myself and reaching a higher level. That is the way I come to the giving of the Torah. That's the best way. So let's read that. Let's read that inside 17a.
The Batusim only believed in the written Torah, but rejected the other parts of Torah. The difference between the written Torah and the other parts of Torah is that God spoke the written Torah and Moses wrote it. It was completely from above, whereas the other parts of Torah are revealed through comprehension. The sages of each generation are tasked with toiling intellectually to introduce novel Torah ideas. The Batusim, with their belief only in the written Torah, believe that all of Torah is from above. It was through this prism they regarded the giving of the Torah, and so they claimed was that Shavuot, the day celebrating the giving of the Torah, must be after Shabbat. It must be prefaced by a day that is without toil and that is given from above.
But for the sages, Shavuot doesn't have to be preceded by a Shabbat. The only thing that you need to precede Shavuot is counting, which represents human effort, human toil, because Torah is not a top-down approach. It's not about what comes with the divine inspiration, but it's about how I'm using my intellect to try to connect it. And that's why if you go into any yeshiva today, how is Torah studied? It's people make it theirs. Like that, the Torah doesn't remain something which is aloof, but it actually can be considered your Torah and my Torah. There's a sense of belonging and connection on that level, not as if it's just something that we are there to just pass on and to observe. And once we understand that the goal of Torah is primarily to generate this harmony between God and the human being, then we can appreciate and then we can understand why, according to the Pharisees, Shavuot doesn't have to be following Shabbos. Because it's not about a Shabbos day. Shabbos is not the best preparation for Shavuot. It's actually the human counting, the human effort that is represented in the counting of the Omer. That is the best day to come to the giving of the Torah, whichever day of the week it will fall on. Yes?
But this is just purely one example of obviously a different mindset, different way of living, and different...
Yeah, so this in this example is reflected their general... Yeah.
But are there others, or...
Hey, you want to do more now?
No. Yes, I'm saying, does it go on to... Because this strikes me as just one particular item.
Yeah, so
they picked on. But by the sound of it...
There's many more.
They lived a different way of life as well.
Yeah, so that is a good point. They did live a totally different way of life. But if you try to zero in to what's causing them to live their different way of life, which indeed expresses itself in many, many different laws and in many different ways of doing things, you'd be able to zero in to a certain outlook on what Torah is all about, a certain way that we should relate to it. And that's more the idea. Are we able to zero in to what's really behind it? What's the core of this debate? What's the core of all of these differences? Indeed, many, many. But what's at the core of all of them is this debate of how we should understand what Torah is all about. That is really what's at the core of it. And that's what they were arguing about. Is Torah something that comes from the prophets, it's just a top-down, or is it something that we're involved in? It's a totally different way of looking at things, and that expresses itself in obviously rejecting categorically any part of Torah that has to do with human effort, which is a legislated and a derived and even the received that they rejected, as well as the fact that they rejected all of these other laws and all of these other details. It's all an outcome, and it's all an expression of this point. If you zero in and you be able to define what is the difference and what is their mindset and what is their thinking, this is what it's all about.
Is the difference in modern times, the difference between spirituality and religion? Because with a religion, you've got all that in-depth knowledge, and the other one, you're just having divine faith.
You could probably say it's related and similar, yeah, although it's probably different in many ways as well, but in that aspect it's probably similar. Let's just conclude. We're going to take more questions in a minute. I want to conclude with one last thing, which is what happened to this Dead Sea sect? Where did they go? Have you ever met a Dead Sea Jew today, or a descendant of the Dead Sea Jews? No? Until they were discovered over here, and no one's ever heard of them. What happened to them?
Didn't they follow the Romans? Didn't they follow the Romans?
Okay, so one theory is that they followed the Romans, yeah?
They were at a big disadvantage because the Pharisees held all the high cards.
Okay, so you're saying it wasn't fair for them?
They had the temple, they had the Sanhedrin, they had everything.
So they had it all. So the Pharisees had it going for them. These people didn't. So there's two theories about what happened to them. Either that the Romans killed them out, or that three theories really, that the Romans killed them, or that they totally assimilated and they just dropped the whole thing, or that they came back. And all three of these things could be true for different parts of them. It could be that some of them were killed, some of them came back, and some of them totally went. So the real question we have to ask is not why they're not here. You know what we have to ask is, why are we here? Why what happened to them didn't happen to us? Why is there... You'll never see a Dead Sea sect Jew. But you know what you'll see? A traditional Jew. You may not like them, but you'll see them. Why? Why did they survive? Why did traditional Judaism survive and is here to tell its story today?
Because we follow the tradition.
Exactly. Because we followed the traditions. Let's read that inside. That is the secret to Jewish survival. Following and keeping the traditions. That is what, when the next generation says, I remember what my father did and what my grandfather did, and that is their link in that same chain, and that is how it continues. But if you change from that, for the good or for the bad, no, these guys, they were not liberal. They were very frum. They were extra frum. But you know what the problem was? They went off the beaten path. They tried to change from the way it was being practiced in all generations. And if you do that, you have no chance of survival.
But the likelihood is they were wiped out.
Yeah.
Otherwise, why would they have abandoned the school?
But why did their school of thought not continue? Forget about those people. There's many communities of traditional Judaism that was also wiped out. And it always continued. We're not talking about, yeah?
So let's the Karaites, of course.
Do you? There's a big... Should I tell you something about the Karaites? Let's first read text 18, then I'll tell you something about the Karaites. Yeah? Text 18. Text 18 is a letter from the Rebbe on the subject of Jewish survival, the secret to Jewish survival.
If one wishes to know the secret of Jewish survival under circumstances which have obliterated larger and stronger nations, it is necessary to find the common factor or factors in all the various periods of Jewish history, which would then have to be taken as the basis of Jewish survival.
We'll just stop here for a minute. I just want to interject before we continue. In answering this question of the survival of the Jewish people and why we're here, there's many different ways you can approach it. The way we're going to approach over here is really more of like kind of applying a scientific method. If the science would want to be able to look at a certain species and say, why did this type manage to survive a certain amount of time? What they would do, the way they would have to do it would be by determining which element or which atom, which part of it is there now, and was there then, and then you'll say, oh, it's because of that specific thing that it survived. Yeah? If we want to figure out with any kind of thing what its secret to survival is, we have to put that through a test of different situations, different times, different places, and see which things change and keep changing, which things you can find the same common denominator. The same thing, this kind of scientific test, the Rebbe applies to the Jewish people over here. So it's just a different way of coming to this. Yeah, let's continue now.
This factor was not language, nor country, nor anything else which is often associated with nationhood and nationalism. For in all these things there have been radical changes from one period to another, as anybody familiar with Jewish history knows. The single factor which has preserved our Jewish people throughout the ages, under all kinds of circumstances, has been the fulfillment of the mitzvot in day-to-day life, such as the observance of Shabbat, the putting on of tefillin, and the Torah education of our children. There have always been deviationists. The Torah itself relates that immediately after the Torah was given at Sinai, there were the golden calf worshippers. Similarly, throughout the period of the judges, prophets and kings, as well as in the post-biblical period of the Second Age, Hamikdash and later, these deviationists attempted to steer another course away from traditional Judaism, but they could never take root within the Jewish people. Either the deviationists eventually realized their mistake and returned to the fold of observance of Torah and mitzvot, or they were completely assimilated among the nations of the world.
Have you ever met a Jew as a descendant of the Jewish pagans of the first temple? I don't think so. Have you ever met a descendant of the Dead Sea sect? No. And I'll even say, have you ever met a real Kara Jew? Also not. Or any of these other groups of Frankish Jew or anything like that? You haven't. Why? Because they try to change what Torah and mitzvahs is all about, and therefore it doesn't have a chance to survive. So that's one lesson that we can take from this. Forget about why the Dead Sea sect didn't survive. Why did we survive, and what can we do to ensure that our children and grandchildren and future generations will continue being a link in that change, in that chain. It's one way and one way only. That's message number one from this lesson. But there's message number two from this lesson, which is in the two ways. What we see, the two totally different ways of looking at what Torah and mitzvahs is all about. Then the message, the takeaway message is that we have to deepen our commitment to Torah study and to rigorous Torah study. We're talking about applying ourselves and toiling over, coming to a shir and trying to figure it out and trying to learn it and trying to connect to it, because through that we are actually elevating ourselves and we begin to be able to see the world through godly lenses. And that is what the Pharisees wanted, that is what the sages wanted, and they wanted it for every single Jew. It wasn't reserved for themselves. That's why in the Jewish community there's no such thing as like the rabbi knows it all and it's not there for everyone. All information is there. That's why people are encouraged, come to the shir, come and learn. Learn more than me, you should know more. Because it's there for everyone. Everyone should be part of it. Everyone should be able to experience that connection to Hashem through Torah study the way it's supposed to be. We're going to have a small recap video, which is about 2 minutes, that just recaps the main points of today's lesson. And after that, I'm here all night. If anyone has more questions about the scenes of the Karaites, we can stay for however long anyone wants.
Lesson 1. The Dead Sea Scrolls. 1. The Qumran evidence confirms that the Mishnah preserves reliable information about the Judaism of Temple times, and it reinforces the notion that Mishnaic law was well established before the Temple's destruction. 2. One component of the Mishnah is the received oral Torah, the explanations and specifics that Moses received from God along with the written Torah. It's impossible to perform the mitzvot without the details of the received oral Torah. 3. A second component of the Mishnah is the derived oral Torah, whereby the sages employed the power of logic, guided by principles of derivation, to apply the laws of Torah to various legal questions. 4. A third component of the Mishnah is the legislated rabbinic ordinances designed to safeguard against biblical transgression. The leaders during the Second Temple era sensed a period of religious weakening and thus advocated for fences to be erected around the Torah. 5. The evidence suggests that the Dead Sea sect abandoned these three components of law, choosing instead to be guided by some means of continued divine inspiration. However, the sages taught that halachic rulings may not be reached by prophecy or divine inspiration. 6. In the sectarian approach, human creativity played no role in the realm of the Torah. But the sages taught that human beings must lend their creative thinking to the development of Torah. 7. The world was created in order to allow for the harmonization of the Creator with the created. The goal is not to find God by eschewing our own personality, nor to be physical creatures with no spirituality. Physical creatures and their personalities ought to express God and His ideals. This is accomplished when we intellectually strive to faithfully apply the Torah, following the principles of derivation, to address new circumstances or unanswered questions. 8. The survival of the Jews hinges on their attachment to Torah, the holistic system of the written, received, derived, and legislated.